Today we're going to be using a tank called T54 to learn a little bit more about world history and specifically Iran-Iraq war. Now this is what the math and this channel is about, learning through video games. If you enjoyed this, subscribe because there's more videos coming soon. Now, like I said, this is a tank called T54, and it's a Soviet tank that was produced at the end of Second World War, starting in around 1945, with the production officially starting in 1947. T54, also known as T55 when it got upgraded, is actually the most produced tank in history. There's about something like 100,000 of these machines that have been built by various countries around the world, including China, because China adapted this and created their own design called T59. So up to 50 countries today still use these tanks, and this is not only the most popular tank, but is also the most retrofitted, the most upgraded, and the most rebuilt tank as well. It's been everything from an actual tank to an APC to transport people to even a firefighting machine that basically uses a huge sort of a turbine to try to extinguish fires. So there's quite a lot of sophisticated retrofitting that has been experienced by this beautiful tank, and it is absolutely gorgeous. The equivalent of this tank in the United States is called M60 Patton. So this is the tank that US released to try to countervene the Soviet threat. And the cool thing about T55 and T54 tanks is that, well, essentially it's the equivalent of AK-47 gun in a tank world. It's very, very popular. It's very robust. It works really well. It's easy to control. It's easy to drive. It's easy to use. You don't really need to learn much to control this tank. And essentially every country in the world, with some exceptions, had a copy of this tank. Another really cool thing about this tank is that it could actually survive a nuclear attack as close as 300 meters away from the actual epicenter. So this is one of the few tanks, at least of that era, that could easily survive a nuclear blast. And the only problem was that the people inside the tank might actually die from radiation. But for that reason, the Soviet Union started developing some really cool upgrades for this tank to make it impenetrable and indestructible from the inside as well. But enough about this tank, let's actually start our game and let's get into the battle and also talk about Iran-Iraq war. Now, why Iran-Iraq war? Well, that's because it's one of the few wars where this tank was actually actively used, and it also featured one of the biggest tank battles in history. Specifically T54 and T55 versus M42 and M60. So this happened in 1980 and we're going to learn more about it today. This all started with Iranian Revolution, so-called Islamic Revolution of 1979, when the American-supported government was actually overtaken by the Islamic government led by the Islamic leader Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, he's very famous in Iran, and basically he is responsible for establishing what we have in Iran today, so very kind of a Islamic-based government. Now, because of this event, though, the government and also the army in Iran actually became very weak. There were a lot of purges, similar to purges in the Soviet Union, and so basically the government lost a lot of its prowess, and what used to be the fifth most powerful army in the world now became the shadow of its former self. And as a result, in September of 1980, Iraqi military under the command of Saddam Hussein decided to invade Iran, which they've actually done quite successfully at first. So because Iran was in so much trouble, Hussein and his army didn't really have much trouble in gaining superiority. They've basically established air force superiority, they had more ships, and they've used a lot of T-54 tanks to advance quite quickly. But this didn't last long, and within months, Iran was able to go on the defensive, and they've actually re-established air superiority.
And also, even though Iran actually had American sanctions and didn't really produce new armor or could not really get new tanks, they were still able to defend themselves quite valiantly. Now, most of the Iranian tanks were actually from the US, specifically M60 and Chieftain tanks, which were the equivalent of T54s that Iraq had. But all of these tanks required the American support for maintenance, and since there was a revolution that overthrew American supported government, they couldn't really get anything really, even ammo. And there was one city or a little town called Dezful in southwestern Iran that was actually captured by the Iraqi army, and it was actually at that point held by the Iraqi army. And the Iranians, becoming more confident because of their air superiority and because of some other victories, decided that it was time for us to retake the town and to essentially attack the Iraqi army, even though they knew there was a huge presence of quite a lot of tanks and a lot of armored support in that particular city. And this was meant to be a very large assault, including a tank assault using M47, M48 and M60 tanks and Chieftain tanks, basically the best tanks that Iran had at that time. They were also meant to be 3 armored brigades, an armored division, and also a paratrooper brigade, which were all supposed to be attacking at the same time, and would then basically thrust through the Iraqi defense and possibly even invade Iraq back. And actually, on paper and theory, this plan looked amazing. Iran had more tanks, Iran had more soldiers, and they also had the surprise element, so they were actually about to strike at Iraq without Iraq knowing anything. However, Iran really overestimated their own abilities because they had some major flaws in their army. For one, just like the Soviet Union in 1938-39, because of the purges, Iran had very, very low morale and did not really have any kind of combined arms operation. They really didn't know how to run the army well, and a lot of their officers were very inexperienced. And since this maneuver would require some crazy organization from their army, they were not actually able to execute it very well. Also, Iranians didn't really have any sufficient helicopters or artillery or ammunition support, so there was basically just a tank attack. They had a few airplanes, but they were not as effective at providing air support for the tank, so basically they just decided to use 300 tanks. And most of these tanks were equivalent to their Iraqi counterparts, but because Iran didn't really have any reconnaissance or even any kind of intelligence on the area, they only knew that Iraq had tanks in there. They actually lacked in preparation as well. And lastly, the attack was actually meant to happen in a very unstable location. The ground and the terrain around this area was actually very muddy, and there was quite a lot of flooding and rain, which would obviously become a problem for tanks. So for maneuvering tanks, you need to have really solid terrain, and that's what Iran unfortunately didn't have. So a lot of things went against Iranian planning, and they had no idea what was about to happen. Now, the actual attack happened in 3 stages. So the first was a diversionary attack, where Iran just kind of pretended to attack from one side, but then really attacked the second side, where a lot of mountain troops tried to infiltrate and liberate one of the cities nearby. But really the third attack was the center of the entire plan, and this involved a mechanized division and involved tanks. And basically the idea here was to try to isolate Iraqis and also try to defeat their artillery. And so this was all meant to be a kind of a strike and a surprise attack that would then hopefully drive Iraqis away. But because there were actually floods and because there was a lot of problems with the terrain, the tanks were actually confined to using paved roads. So essentially there was a long column of tanks and even armored brigades and all of the soldiers in one line, so all of them were quite exposed, and this created an opportunity for Iraq to essentially destroy everything. And what made things even worse is that Iraqi spy craft or spy plane actually saw this column moving towards the city, and so their surprise failed completely. Iraqis began to counterattack, and they moved their entire armored brigade with T54 tanks, including some T55 and T62 tanks, to try to attack Iranians. And because T-54 tanks are actually a lot lower and a lot sort of down to earth, what Iraqis did is they actually dug their tanks into positions using some of the mud, and they basically hid their tanks so well that it was really hard to see them. And even if you saw them, it was really hard to hit them because of their low profile. They're actually quite effective at not only hiding but not being hit as well. And so they've set up this trap, including using some of the attack helicopters, to try to basically wait for the Iranians to get to this location and then to essentially try to destroy them. And because the Iranians didn't really have much in terms of intelligence operation or any kind of reconnaissance gathering, they did not see this trap coming, so they literally just walked into it. And because the Iranians did not know how many tanks or what was actually waiting for them, they've decided to really kind of drive through the Iraqi defense and in what's called an armored spearhead. But this actually ended up in causing a lot of losses to the Iranians. And so the only T-54s that were destroyed by the Iranians were actually by their attack helicopters. They used to have Sea Cobra helicopters from the US, which joined the battle and destroyed several of the tanks, but because Iraqis also had anti-aircraft weapons, the Iranians ended up losing these helicopters as well. This whole battle became essentially slaughter of Iranian forces. Iraqi forces from other locations joined in. They even brought anti-tank weapons, and so all of the Iranian tanks began to be destroyed. But to make things even worse than that, one of the Iraqi aircraft actually flew behind the Iranian army and destroyed one of the pontoon bridges that were built across the river, trapping the entire Iranian force and preventing their retreat. So essentially, they were isolated and they were outmaneuvered and also possibly already outnumbered. And this really created a huge chaos and huge panic within the Iranian forces. A lot of them abandoned their tanks, a lot of them just ran for it, and any kind of infantry that was left fighting was essentially outmaneuvered and also outnumbered by the huge numbers of T-54 tanks that Iraqi army had. And so in total, Iran lost anywhere between 88 and possibly even 215 tanks. It really depends on who you listen to. Iraqi claimed it was 214 and Iranians claimed it was 88, but it was a lot of tanks. A lot of the American tanks were lost, and they've also lost their armored vehicles, around 100 of them, and heavy artillery, and basically the entire armored division was almost completely annihilated. And in terms of actual percentages, about 20% of their entire armored force was actually destroyed in this battle by the Iraqi tanks. And since there was a US sanction against Iran, these tanks would never be replaced, and they essentially were kind of useless now. So Iran had to strategize and try to figure out things and try to get new tanks from somewhere else. But nevertheless, at least 45 Iraqi tanks were also destroyed as well, so a lot of the T-54 and some of the T-62 tanks were destroyed, and most of them were destroyed because of this static positioning. So because they were dug into the mud, they were kind of stuck in that location, and so once you saw the tank, you could either use anti-tank weapons or even helicopter attacks to try to destroy it. And so Iraqi strategy was not particularly amazing as well. They should have used more mobile tanks, and they should have considered even counterattacking Iranian forces afterwards. But nevertheless, these tanks could actually be easily replaced by purchasing them from the Soviet Union, which Iraq actually did. But Iranian forces were stuck with those American tanks they couldn't replace anymore. But despite this being a loss for the Iranian army, and really because of their disarray and because of the chaos due to the revolution they've experienced, Iran would then go on the offensive, and this bloody war that would last for 8 years would then actually end in a partial victory for Iran. But this is something we can talk about in one of the future videos. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. This was a little bit different from what I usually do, but hopefully this taught you a little bit more about history, and you've also enjoyed me being destroyed and also destroying other tanks using this beautiful T-54. Now, this is a game called Armored Warfare. It's a game that's absolutely free, so check out this game in the description below and get it if you like tanks or if you like a little bit more history. In one of the future videos, if you guys would like me to do more of these, we'll talk about some other events where T-54 or other tanks that this game has played a role and influenced the worlds for the best or for the worst. So once again, this is T-54, the most produced, most modified, and possibly even most unknown tank in the world. Thank you for watching, and game you later. And don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Bye bye.